when Ed told me about this topic, I went through and read the Book of Jonah over. Luckily, it's one of the very short ones, not much longer than the in the full than the children's book that we just heard. And what stood out to me is that Jonah is a complete mess. I mean, he over and over says about his love and his overwhelming faith in God, but he bursts into fear and anger. He's impulsive. He is self-destructive. He can't he says that he wants to die over several times because of his anger. And I know that Ed has political thoughts on this, but the first thing that came to mind with me was mental illness. I'm currently reading the memoir of a man with borderline personality disorder, which is characterized by unstable moods and reckless, impulsive actions. The characteristic of it is saying, I hate you, don't leave me. They can fly off the handle and behave irrationally, can be terrible in relationships, but they also have close to the highest rate of suicide among any disorders, with nearly 10% of those with BPD dying by suicide. And then that is not the diagnosis of, my Aunt Hockey passed away just this Friday at the age of 89, peacefully while in hospice. She was the second oldest in my father's family and the closest in age to him as the eldest. And she was really troubled. She was institutionalized for most of her life. I don't think she had BPD, but she had, I don't know about her diagnosis actually, but she had desperate problems, and I never really got to know her, even though she lived in an apartment over our garage for many years. Her English was terrible, my Korean was worse, and her behavior was also isolating. I remember what I remember most was an incident when I was a teenager. She and my father were arguing in the kitchen, and she grabbed up a kitchen knife and threatened him with it. They were arguing in Korean. It was going too quickly. I couldn't understand. She then went off back to her apartment over the garage. The police were called, and they eventually broke into there and had to carry her off handcuffed to a stretcher. I have no idea what she was thinking at that time or what they were arguing over. I got the impression that they were arguing over money, but he didn't want to talk about it. Despite, or maybe because he is a psychiatrist, my father is reluctant to talk about some things, in particular about his family. But I suspect that a big part of why he went into psychiatry was because of problems in his own family. And I often clash with my father. I have a lot of problems with him too. But I also have to remember where they came from. And so can we bring up the slide here? So that's a picture in 1946 of my father's family. My Aunt Hockey is the second from the left in the back. She's 11 in this picture, and that's my father, second from the right in the back. He's 13. This is in the brief gap between the liberation from the Japanese and the Korean War. So they're at a new farm which they have in the south of Korea. They grew up and lived in the north originally, but they moved south because not wanting to be part of the Russian administration. A few years later, they'd have to desperately flee this farm on a train from the North Korean troops. Thanks. You can bring that down. And so I had no idea of this. I grew up insulated from all of this. I've read about it and now heard stories, seen some pictures, but it's really impossible for me to imagine the trauma and the change that they went through. I think trauma goes larger than individuals. It also affects whole families and societies. And to Ed's topic, I've read a lot about the history of Palestine and Israel, and their war has been going on for decades. It's on and off, but it's a deep trauma that goes back to the Holocaust and the first Arab-Israeli wars. Is a huge amount of violence and trauma that families go through on all sides in that region. And so there are more lessons that we can and should learn about how to follow with this. But I want to keep in mind, before I judge my late aunt for grabbing up that kitchen knife, I want to think about how she grew up. Yeah, sorry. Just want to think about how she grew up. And with the violence that she's facing, that's impossible to ignore. That produces wounds that are hard to heal, that produce impulsiveness, maybe some grasping, maybe some greed. Maybe she was holding that knife to demand more money from my father. And I don't think that's right? But it was kind of traumatic for me to experience as a teenager. But I also have to think about what she went through. And sorry. So I've also spoken, of people from Palestine and from Israel. And I want to keep that same humility in mind as I judge. I want to respect their experience, even if I disagree with them. So, yes. Thank you.
Pause for a moment of silence, please. May the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight. We're going to talk this morning about a very difficult, complicated topic. All of us, without exception, I'm sure, are sad and sorrowful as we every day encounter the sufferings that are going on in Palestine and Israel and the Mideast as part of this very long, ongoing conflict between Jewish and Arab and Palestinian people in the Mideast. It has a long history that is infused with geopolitics and all kind of rivalries in the area, but it's also infused with the long history of Judaism and then later Islam, a little bit of Christianity thrown in with the Crusades, and later evangelical interpretations of things. But it's hard to know the intensity of the conflict without knowing more about the religious part of it. And for that reason, I picked on Jonah. It's actually my favorite book in the Bible, followed by the book of Ruth. And to understand them, one has to look at the place in life when those books were written, what was happening in Israel when Jonah and Ruth were written. And if you want to know that, you can read the short book of Ezra. It describes the return of 3 generations of Palestinians from Babylon. Persian King Cyrus changed his mind. Apparently God told him to let these people go back to Israel, let them go back to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. And it describes the migration of hundreds, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Jewish people who had been taken away from Babylon taken away from Jerusalem or Israel 3 generations earlier. He came back and started telling people how to organize Israel, to rebuild the temple, and to make the country strong again. And he realized they had some really bad enemies. All around them were people that didn't have much appreciation for the return of these people. And he said that all the men of Israel, you have to get rid of your non-Jewish wives. If you're married to a Moabite girl, get rid of her and get rid of your children. If any of you who are married to non-Jewish people, have to get rid of them, the wives and their children. You have to, and what is the Ruth about? The book of Ruth? Well, Ruth was a Moabite girl, and she accompanied her widowed mother Naomi back to Jerusalem from a sojourn in Moab. And she was favored by God and married a person named Boaz, who was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David, the greatest king in Israel. So Ruth is a story why the best king of Israel, the one revered by all, was married to a Moabite girl. And along comes the book of Jonah, a literary form. Jonah was not a real person. He was a man who symbolized the behavior of the Jewish people at this time, not liking the people around them, punishing them any way they could. And Jonah was being told by God that I'm the God of all creation. I'm the God of all people. If the people of the Philistines or the Moabites or anybody else, if they repent and start living in my way, I will spare them. And Jonah was small and petty, as Hanju described, that he couldn't accept the turnaround required to embrace an enemy that he disliked so long. But through the ages, they rebuilt the temple. It was destroyed again in the year 70 by the Romans. And then for 600 and some years, the slowly Jewish people expanded into Yemen and what is now Saudi Arabia. And the whole Mideast, there were Jewish people, in small settlements living all through the area when the Prophet Muhammad came along. And then with the rise of Islam, and even there was, most of the time there wasn't conflict between Islam and the Jewish and also Christian people. But through the whole Middle Ages, the Jewish people survived with the rituals they had from the Pentateuch, and the belief that God had chosen them, and if they would be His people, He would be their God and see them through all their troubles. And as they dispersed through the Balkans in Europe, and there were by 1890 or so, there were several million Jewish people living in Russia and what is Poland and the Balkan region. And in the later part of the Tsars, anti-Semitism became much worse. There had always been some of it, but millions of Jewish people began gradually to move out of. Many came to the United States, Canada, England, all over Europe to get away from the pogroms in Europe, and also a small number of them began to migrate to Israel as a part of what became known as the Zionist movement. Under the leadership of a very small number of Jewish people in Europe, up until 1917 to World War I, 6,000 or 8,000 Jewish people had settled in Palestine with the help of sponsoring organizations. People would come to Israel, to Palestine, and offer money to landowners or the rulers to buy up land so Jewish people could settle in villages. And by World War I, there were 600 or 700 villages of Jewish people, mostly living peaceably with their neighbors in Palestine. After World War I, pogroms became more intense in Europe. The Dreyfus affair in France and other things that happened to make more and more Jewish people dread the expansion of anti-Semitism in Europe, and more migrations occurred to Israel. As more than 100,000 people now lived in Palestine, and conflicts became more intense, began to have intense conflicts over ownership of land, and many of these new settlers did not speak Arabic or were totally different from the Palestinian people, who were mostly uneducated farmers who didn't have the capital and resources of these new settlers, and it was easy conflicts to arrive. The conflicts became very intense leading up to World War II, with the first Infantata, the first uprising from about 1935 to 1939, and thousands of Jewish people and thousands of Palestinian people were killed. And along came World War II and made the thing much more complicated. Now the British government had, after World War I, received a mandate to manage Palestine until it gets someday independent. And during the World War II, England favored the Arabs to help them fight against the Turkish Empire, the Ottomans. And they were in the middle of the conflict between the Arabs and the Jewish people in Palestine. And as World War II came to an end, England was extremely frustrated being caught in the middle of the conflict over the Palestinian settlers who wanted to create a homeland for the Jewish people. There were hundreds of thousands now living in Europe after the killings of so many Jewish people by the Nazis, and more than 200,000 were desperately trying to find a homeland, and no one else really wanted them. And there are many sad stories about the efforts to resettle people back from Europe into what became Israel. And finally, England gave up, said to heck with it, turning this over to the United Nations. And in a very short period of time, in 1946 and 1947, a small majority of the United Nations decided to create a state of Israel, a homeland for Jewish people that would be a partition of Palestine into two parts, one for the Jewish people and one for the Palestinian people. And all of the agreements along the way said that the rights and interests of the Palestinians would be protected. Instantly, conflicts began to break out. It's hard to understand the intensity of it, but the Palestinian people suddenly didn't want the Arab surrounding people, and the Palestinians didn't want a new Jewish state to be created in their midst, and they resisted it. But the resistance always failed because Israel, was fighting for its homeland. It was trying to survive. It was given help by Jewish resources all over the world, including the United States and England and other countries. And they won every single one of the wars. And they slowly increased, the area that belonged to the state of Israel by taking it, like the Golan Heights and so on. And a brief pause for refreshment of the brain. From the very beginning of the creation of the state of Israel, there were leaders within the government who wanted Israel to expand right then, to take establish the whole West Bank over to the Jordan River. They wanted to start putting settlements. Others opposed this because it wasn't part of the agreement. But to this date, now more than 300,000 Jewish settlers live in this West Bank area that is not a part of the state of Israel. It was part of the, supposed to be the future state of Palestine. And it's hard to imagine any vision of peace when you're managing an area of colonies, where you have colonized an area with illegal settlements. Is there, what can the hope be for a better outcome for this? I think there are a couple of reasons to be hopeful. One example of what can happen is what happened in 1971, under President Carter at the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin spent 9 days with Jimmy and Rosalind Carter. He finally persuaded them to an agreement that peace between Israel and Egypt was in both their interests. And part of that agreement was a treaty 1 year later, and part of that agreement that the Jewish settlements in Sinai would be removed, and they were. And that the Sinai Peninsula still is, is a part of Egypt. It was, despite the wars, it remained with Egypt, and the settlements were removed. And there's little things are happening in the secular government of Israel. For example, the neo-Orthodox young men have to take part in the army now. They can't spend all their time in their religious studies. One can hope that more leaders will emerge within the government of Israel that will question the political strategy of the current government, and we can all hope. And I can't be too optimistic about the outcome yet. We can all hope that there will be some way for a rapprochement to occur between the West and Iran to get all the arms and all the encouragement of the different groups that are also supporting the Palestinians. So it's a hard thing to be hopeful about, but with hope, one part of the religion of Israel that God would help His people. All they had to do was keep the covenant they had made, and the prophet Jonah had a hard time turning around to go a different direction. Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin did. Hopefully, more and more leaders on both sides will see that possibility that we can hope can continue.